Well,
Don't screw this up.
I appreciate that, and he didn't tell you the whole story from last night. We were going back and forth, and I said, be aware, you may introduce me, but I get to follow that up for about an hour. So I think he chickened out of busting me pretty hard. But anyway, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jay Mahaffey. I manage the Learning Center for Bayer in Scott, Mississippi. And I'm going to try to live up to what Brent just told you about me, but he's right. I am a cotton person at heart. We do a lot of different things at the Learning Center. When they asked me if I had an interesting topic or two to share with y'all today, I jumped all over that because the opportunity to share and talk about what we do at Scott really is sort of turned into my existence. We don't just idle around there and pursue academic curiosities, though. The thing I want to point out to you is I appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all today. I'm going to share with you a couple of sort of philosophical shifts I think that have occurred in agriculture in my career. We're going to talk about what they mean, but I think it's worthwhile to mention the background of this. We're there on the bank of Deer Creek, on the headwaters of Deer Creek, if it's fair to call Deer Creek having headwaters. It starts right there at my office. We're farming about 400 acres of that deep silty sand. We plant corn, cotton, and beans on it, and we do it at your and growers' request. That's something that I think is fairly unique to the process around Scott. Growers give us most of the material that we work on. Now we pursue it and follow it up, and we certainly do some company things. We introduce new products and new technologies, and I meddle in a bunch of different projects around the company. But our focus is having people visit and see what we do in the fields there. This is all public information. It's all available to you. Y'all consider yourselves permanently invited. A bunch of you are going to come see me anyway this summer, I suspect. But it's open for the public. It's open for comment, too. We're not afraid of being called dummies. If you think there's something we ought to do better, different, something we ought to change, let us know. Now, the things I'm going to show you today are the summary of some of the work that we've done over time, and it's a very unique analysis and a very unique way to present the things that we've worked on. We grow all three crops in that very productive Delta environment. We manage and try to do things in a realistic way that demonstrates the return on investment in the places where people ought to worry. And I'm not directly going to talk today about corn or soybeans very much. We can have that conversation if y'all want to. We work on them a lot. But there's places where we need to worry, and there's places where we really kind of can ease on down the road and apply that effort somewhere else. And that's what we do in that environment. One of the focus areas that we have at the Learning Center is try to figure out how these crops interact, how they're grown together, and how they behave. Because I had this concern as a cotton farmer. Well, I'm not a farmer, but at Delta Pine, I had been a cotton person with a dab of soybeans. Well, now we've all basically, particularly in the Delta, gone from being cotton people growing grain to grain people growing cotton, particularly corn. And the philosophical shifts and changes that occurred as a result of that are what led to the presentation I'm going to show y'all today. You think about it, cotton is a crop, or corn is a crop that is farmed a very different way than cotton. What we wind up doing in corn is we make 8 or 9 decisions before we plant that determine the yield potential of a cornfield. Most of those, almost all of those, are done at or during planting. You think about it, planting date, row configuration, hybrid seed treatment technology, planting uniformity, planting depth, planting population are all determined at planting. That is a planning process for corn. You think about cotton, and I don't ever hardly say anything negative about cotton, but what I would tell you about cotton is you know you're going to plant it and it's going to spend 3 weeks trying to die. And after you get out of the herbicide damage and the thrips beat out of it, it's going to grow too fast. Then you're going to apply growth regulators, and the battle is won in cotton from the time it's about that tall to the end. In corn, it's won either right before or during planting time. You protect the yield potential in corn you establish at planting by fertilizing it, spraying it, and doing all that other stuff to it. In cotton, we accumulate yield potential during the center of the season. And my concern as we shift these crops around is we need to be worried about some of that stuff differentially. And that's really how we built the program of the Learning Center at Scott. Now, what I'm going to show you today is the summary and sort of the accumulation of several presentations that I've done over time. One of them is I titled it Cotton Chronicles. That's the bunker where we store the seed, a bunch of the seed relics from over time at Scott. And the more I thought about it, the more appropriate it became to call it a chronicle. Because it really is this story of that developed over time across a bunch of eras of change. And this is something we do every year. This little demonstration in the field is the simplest thing that we do, and it's the most popular with the visitors. We have about 2,000 visitors in the next 2 months coming to Scott or so. It'll wind up being more than that. You look at that slide that's on the screen there. Each of those 8-row plots grows the same amount of lint based on the year it represents. So this 8 rows over here on the left grew the same amount of lint in 1937 that this over here grew in 2017. That tells you how much more productive our cotton is today, but think about why that happened. That's the important part. From 37 to 57, you're talking about mainly improvements in insecticides. And 1937 was mostly pre-synthetic fertilizer. It was pretty close to organic farming if you get right down to it. Think about from 57 to 77, that's variety improvements, additional pesticides. The world changed. We became more scientifically advanced in our ability to screen and use things. But the ones that get me going, you go from 77 to 97, think about what a basket of good stuff happened in there. That was Delta Pine 50 and 20 and Stoneville 825 and 213. Those are varieties most folks in here probably never saw. But they changed the world. Also, you had aldicarb. You had all kinds of carbamates invented. We had picks in the late 70s. We had pyrethroids in the late 70s. We learned things about that in the late 90s. About the time I came along, we got into Bollgard and Roundup Ready. But the one that gets me going is this one over here at 17. There were some changes brought on by all that technology that we have to address with our management practices today, and that's what I'm going to show you and talk to you a little bit about. What it amounts to is we can accumulate more fruit as a result of improvements in pest control. We got rid of the threat from the boll weevil, which was a wise thing everybody did. It's the wisest thing any commodity group's ever done, to get rid of the boll weevil, and we need to keep it gone. We also got rid of most of the threat, as far as I'm concerned, all the threat from tobacco budworms. You remember 95, what a mess that was. That's sort of the thing I grew up in, probably put me in this business. But those pest species are gone, or at least greatly minimized in their threat. So we can set more fruit. We don't have that insect damage sniping away at us all year. The question is, can we hold it? And that's really the gist of what I'm going to share with you today and why all this stuff is so important to the success of the cotton varieties we're growing today. All of this, the short answer, and I don't give many short answers, but the short answer is it's enabled by less determinate varieties, which is a long way of saying they're better energy factories today than they used to be, but that comes with a price. And we're going to talk about that price in a minute. I'd also add, though, we didn't do this in a vacuum. This sort of thing's been building over time for a long time. And some of y'all remember Delta Pine 90. That was one of the first memories I have of a cotton field, toting a bag of Delta Pine 90. It probably weighed more than I did, or dragging it as much as anything. That was a variety we grew almost pre-growth regulator because it was drought tolerant. It was very indeterminate. It would turn into a tree. It did all kinds of things you'd expect cotton to do. Well, then we learned a little bit about how to manage it more accurately and a little more aggressively, and then we got into things like, really by necessity, New Cotton 33B was one of the first Bollgard varieties. That one came along, and people wanted to use it because it had Bollgard in it, but it was also one of the most aggressive sets of germplasm anybody had ever touched in the Mid-South. So we learned how to manage it. Then we got 555. I know all the sensitivity about 555. I was there when it happened. That was a grand discovery that taught us how to grow and manage cotton much more aggressively than ever. And now we're back to 1646, which is the deal of the day. That's getting sort of sniped at by some replacement candidates that can do what it does and better in some environments. But it's been the biggest cotton variety ever in the history. And this is not in here, I'm not in here to talk about varieties, but these are examples of the shifts and the changes that occurred. I found this data, and you don't get by hearing me talk without seeing some data. And I apologize for the nerdy graphs ahead of time, but some days that's how it works. This was where we introduced Bollgard in 1995, or the varieties that contain Bollgard in 1995. And the only important point of it is, you see, across that 40 locations, the average first position retention in those fields of that 40 locations was 53%. If you go out and measure it the same way today, I don't know exactly what number you get, but I suspect it's at least in the high 70s. It's probably higher than that in individual fields. You don't finish, right now we got a lot of fields that are way, way up there in retention. They don't finish that high. But the point of it is we're setting more fruit. And another important point and change that occurred is we changed how the plant is programmed, and it's not just Delta Pine. Everybody in this business did this. Some of it's not as obvious why it happened, but we changed the programming of the plant where it can hold more fruit because it's a better energy factory. And that all started out with me in this growth regulator evaluation that we do at Scott, and I'm going to talk about it, but I also want to share this little piece. This is a sort of a cobbled together part of another presentation that I was given as an assignment. I had a sales manager call me and say, look, I know all these cotton varieties are different, and I know you love them all, but come to Texas and give them a talk for me. He said, I'm going to give you a title, and by the way, I don't want to hear all that racket on the telephone from you today. Just take the title, do the talk, come give it, because he knew I was going to object to this title, How a Cotton Plant Thinks. Well, the short answer to that is a cotton plant doesn't think. I had an old cotton farmer the other day tell me, how long did it take you to figure that out? But, reality of the matter is it does not think. But I'll openly admit to you, when I got ready to do this presentation for Tom, I sat down and just chuckled to myself the entire Thanksgiving week as I put this together, because the more I messed with it, the more sense it made. Plants don't think, but they're programmed by nature to do things. And when you think about what we're dealing with here, we're dealing with two species of cotton in the U.S. Mainly all this is hirsutum upland cotton that we grow in the Mid-South. There's some barbadense, and that's a whole nother matter. That's a bag of tricks that you really need to study carefully before you engage it. But you're growing a perennial indeterminate plant as an annual crop. Now the other catch to that is it's full of feedback loops, and it's very much like the thermostat in my view. If the thermostat's set on cool, it gets hot in here, it's going to turn on about 4 switches in a row in a certain order. The air outside's going to come on. When they all close or open or whatever they're supposed to do, the air's going to go off. Well, the plant does that too. It senses that stuff in the environment, and it changes as a result of what it senses. The short of it is, it's programmed, a cotton plant's programmed by a tree. And it thinks it's a pecan tree. And the implications of that to our management are immense. And there are times, I think personally, we go backwards about this. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I get hung up on the idea, how am I going to make all the lint I want to make? Well, the plant is not out there to make blue jeans. It's out there to reproduce. It wants to make a seed, and you got to keep that in mind. It wants to make a seed and outcompete a neighbor so its genes and genetics move on into the next generation. Well, that is overriding programming to the plant, and we move that around and change that a little bit. But another underlying factor is it's perennial, and I'll get to what that means in a minute. But the breeders, they have some influence on this, obviously. Y'all remember the earliest, most determinate variety I ever remember us growing. It was not one of ours. It was Stonewall. It was 453. That, some of y'all remember it. It was very determinate. That was back in the days when the world swapped to 50 and 20 and 125 and all of that, trying to outrun the budworms to the end. Then the least determinate thing I remember is something we've probably never grown here. Some of those 15 series varieties that we've released lately. They're very, very long season. So the breeders have some influence, but the best way I know to put it is a chameleon changes colors, but he's still a lizard. And that's kind of what we do when we manipulate and move around these cotton varieties like we do. So what does it all mean? And this is a conversation I have with about every grower group that comes and goes at Scott. And I don't mean to talk down to anybody, but I'm going to share this with you because I think this has influence on the conversation moving forward. I ask questions, and I rarely ever call anybody out unless there's a joker in the crowd that wants to play. But which fruiting form sheds first? End of this week or first of next week, the phone's going to start ringing, and it's going to be people saying, all the squares falling off my cotton plants. Now, every once in a while you get a call about that, and it may be squares. If you do that, first thing I want is a picture of them. Because I don't know that I've ever asked for that picture that I didn't get a picture of a handful of those after that phone call. That is a distinctly different fruiting form than a square. That is a 5 or 6 day old boll post-bloom. And that has influence and matters for a lot of reasons. And I'm building to something here. Y'all just watch the story for a second. This is an entirely different matter. Now, why does that newly bloomed boll shed first? All right? Squares, for the most part, and this is not entirely correct, but for the most part, squares make enough photosynthate, enough sugar to support and do their development the way they need to do it. So the plant really doesn't know they're there that much. The boll over here, these are two older bolls, whether that opener or that one that's reasonably mature, that was probably 28 days old or so, 20 days old anyway. They're a pretty good chance the plant's already going to reproduce from them anyhow, so it's not going to shed those for the most part. Deeper you get into stress, the bigger a boll will shed, but regardless, that's a pretty good shot at reproducing, and the plant's already invested its time and energy into it. This one, though, the seed that's in that newly bloomed boll sends a hormonal signal to the plant that says, I'm fixing to make seed oil, which is a really, really energy-dense storage medium, and all these carpels and all this stuff in here, and I need a bunch of sugar to do that. The seed says, send it to me. Well, if the plant's loops and feedbacks and senses say, I don't have any sugar to send you, what's it going to do to that? It's going to shed that. It's going to weigh on these to rain, and it's going to hold those and try to keep them on the plant. Because by the time you get a boll, the size of your big thumbnail or a little bigger, you can't hardly beat that off there with a hammer. It's going to hold those. And that's the logic the plant uses if you can say there's anything logical about it. And I think you can. There's a lot of it. So let's talk about what all this means. Why does the plant grow taller as it sheds fruit typically? Now there's lots of other things that play there. And I'm not saying physiological square shed doesn't happen, it does. But most of the time the squares stay there anyway. So why does cotton grow taller in response to fruit loss? Well, think about what's happened. The plant itself has plenty of sugar available, generally speaking, because some stress has been removed. It started to make a little bit of sugar. It shed some fruit. The demand's not as great, whatever. But regardless, there's more energy available to make more plant, and the plant says, I got plenty of sugar and less fruit. Let's get on with it. I'm going to be taller. I'm going to make more nodes. That gives me a better chance to reproduce even more. And also, it doesn't matter if I do it this year. I'm perennial, so I just wait and do it next year if I run out of time. Well, bankers don't buy that I know of. So we got to find a way around that whole conversation. And there are a lot of reasons that sugar is limited. Some of them are good. Some of them are not. And I know everybody gets in that conversation about, I got somebody in the neighborhood putting sugar on their crops. That's not what I'm saying. We'll talk about that later. Y'all catch me tonight after a couple of drinks and we'll talk about that. But anyway, what we're talking about is the dynamic of being able to feed the fruit. So you think about why carbohydrate would become limited. Well, you could not be making it because it's cloudy. Y'all know that's the typical historical fruit shed. You think about those very determinate varieties that get cloudy one afternoon, the middles fill up with newly bloomed bolls. Also, it could be going into a big fruit load. That's a good one. That's a nice problem to have if you get fruit shed for that reason. Also, it could be going into excess vegetation. Or it could be drought, anything that limits the productivity of the plant. But if it's going into excess vegetation, that's the one I've got the control over. And that's what we spend our time at Scott. When it talk about studying cotton varieties, we study them a whole bunch of different ways. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the neater results that we have to share. We take a group of cotton varieties, and I apologize for that small print, and we manage them in certain ways. Now, some of what we do is just farming. Some of it's screening genetics. Some of it's doing all kind of things. But we'll have 3 treatments out in the field. We'll have an untreated check, we'll have a passively managed plot, and we'll have an aggressively managed plot. Now, all the details may not necessarily matter in this context, but I'm going to share them with you. Untreated, no growth regulator, cotton in its natural state. You know what that's going to look like. The aggressively managed is this treatment right here on the bottom, and I'm not saying go home and manage your cotton that way. There are times and fields where that's the appropriate case. But I would point something out to you. That's as legally and biologically aggressive as you can be with growth regulators in cotton. A lot of folks don't realize 48 ounces is the limit, yearly limit on the label. And I stay on the label because I can't publish this stuff if I don't. I realize the rest of the world views that a little differently, but that's what we do in our work there at Scott. Now, the passive you see starts about 10 days after the aggressive at about 75% of the rate. So what I've got there is the ability to take all these different varieties sprayed the same way on the same day with the same rates. And then at the end, we collect some data that tells me something about how these varieties act. And that's what a grower wants to know. And I will pre-apologize a little bit to some in the room that are expecting a bunch of statistics. I fight with myself daily not to do that. Now I do it because I can't help it. I like numbers and I like to play that game. And I want to know what's statistically significant. A lot of the materials that we present to growers, you know, that's not the style that we present that in. But it's not on these slides is what I'm saying. I've got a lot of it. We'll take data out of all these trials and all these varieties. I'm showing you the extremes here. This is 2019's result, and you see where we didn't use any growth regulator at all. We made about 650 pounds of cotton, and what we did, no matter what we did, we almost doubled that in either of the other two treatments. That's averaged across everything out there. I can tell you too, some of those in that untreated check that year didn't make 200 pounds, 250 pounds. So, you know, that's cotton unmolested with nothing done to it. So we need to intervene where we get growth out of sync, you know, out of phase. And we've got the ability to do that with growth regulators. And I know y'all probably can't see all that writing on that slide, but I want to show you something, and this is leading to a bigger story. I've got several years of this data, which is the magic of what I came to show y'all this morning, but this is the final plant height, because the best gauge of growth control in cotton is not yield, it's height. You know, it's actual growth reduction I'm looking for. The yield accumulates as a result of all those interactions. But the bottom line of it is, when you look at what happened, at the end of the year, the height tells me most directly what's up. So here, you see all this earlier stuff. These are ranked from early to late, or determinate, less determinate, or more determinate to less, however you want to put it. Don't worry about all the numbers, but look at this in the middle here. Something's different on each side of that graph from the middle. So you think about why that's different. And what I'm saying is different. Look, this green bar is the final plant height of the aggressive treatment in all the 3 bar combinations. When you look at that right there, you notice the more aggressive I get in those more determinate genetics, the shorter I can make them. You look over here in these later things, not so much. So what does that mean? Some of that stuff on the left side of that graph is more sensitive to growth regulation than the right. Now don't misinterpret what I'm saying. Don't look at this and say, I'm going to go home manage 1646 passively because it didn't matter. That's not the message. The message is you don't have the ability to be more aggressive and do it any better in those later materials if they get out of position. And when I say out of position, I mean sort of misplanted. Maybe you put a variety on a strong piece of dirt at a real high population and you didn't go into it with the mindset to aggressively manage. That's mispositioned. But that's how we characterize products. And the flip of it is, this is the same data flipped around. You look over here, we reduced the height of this set on the left side of that graph about 40% on average. On the other side, you reduce the height of these about 30%. So, no kidding. Some are more sensitive than others. But there's another little piece of magic that came out of this, and this tickles me. During the COVID times, there's something good in about everything. And during COVID, I didn't have a whole lot of people coming around, and you bottle me up at Scott for 18 months and don't let me talk to many people, and I get sort of stir crazy with that. So I was playing with data, and I realized that I had about 12 or 13 years, depending on how you count, of this growth regulator protocol done the same way with the same rates across a whole big, broad bunch of genetics. I thought, oh, wait a minute, let's see what we got here. So I started playing with it, and I had put in a request for a new statistics program that I wanted, JUMP. JMP, always is menu-driven SAS. It's kind of a downgraded version of SAS, sort of, not entirely. Well, I had this big data set built, and I thought I was getting on to something that might matter. And I got to playing with it one night up at the office. I remember it was a real cold winter night, and there was nobody else there. And I got to playing with it, and all of a sudden, I think I found it. And I got this program downloaded, and all of a sudden I really got deep into it, and I realized there's something in this data that's meaningful. And I'll show you what. But the thing I want to emphasize is when we do this trial, this is set up to be a mess. I'd planted out there on that 13 CEC soil at high population, planted late, put 130 or 40 pounds of N under it. I want to create a growth control problem to stretch the differences among the varieties so I can tell a grower that comes and goes, all right, you better be careful with that one. And there's some folks that I would tell you don't need to grow that one because they're not going to be aggressive enough. But we need the information up front, and that's the system that we built to do it. So after I got all this data put together, I started down the path of, all right, let's look at these varieties, whether they're more or less sensitive to growth control. And I'll ask you the question I ask all the growers that come to Scott. If I don't use any growth control, what would you guess is the tallest variety in these tests every year? Somebody always says, what? 1646. Every time, that's what I thought, and I was wrong, and so were they. And that set the magic down the path, I think. If you look at it, this is where I started this analysis. You got more and less sensitive to growth control products, just broadly split that way. The more sensitive products are 5 inches taller than the less, where I don't use any growth control. When I say the more sensitive, those are things like 1518, 2012, 1916, a bunch of that earlier, more determinate, easier to control because they're more sensitive. They're also taller, where I don't use any growth control, but I make them shorter with the same rates on a percentage basis. They're more sensitive. Well, no kidding. That's what the categories say, more and less sensitive. You see, I don't make these necessarily as much shorter. Well, there's some implication to all that. Look at the yields across that. There's 402 or 3 data points in this split out different ways. Look at the yields. You notice why the world has gone to growing less sensitive, or in other words, less determinate, less sensitive to growth control products. It's because they yield more with no picks and they yield more with either treatment applied. In other words, in my view, the yield potential is higher no matter what you do to them. That's how 1646 and some of those things became as successful as they are. They're better cottons. It's not just the Delta Pine stuff. There's lots of things included in that category. So if we're going to concentrate on growing those and we need to know where the danger is and what to do to them, that's really where it hit. But I knew there was something in this data that it was in there, I could feel it, but I couldn't see it. And I kept manipulating this a little bit more. And by the way, there will be a much more statistically illuminated version of this in a journal sooner or later somewhere, but I ain't quite got that far. I got to find a cooperative statistician first. But I split them one more time. And when I split them one more time, I realized something. The information is partly contained in that untreated check. Because when it surprised me that those easier to manage products are actually the tallest ones with no picks, I suddenly realized height's not the only answer. It's not the only thing that tells me how a variety behaves. So I split them again into 4 categories. I split them as to whether they were short or tall in the untreated check, and I split them as to whether they were more or less sensitive to PGRs. And when I say I split them, roughly down the middle. Top half, bottom half of the population, right, left side of the graph, that kind of thing. Well, if they're short, which are what these on this side, on the left side of that are, their odds are, if they're short in the check, they're probably not going to be that difficult to manage. Not going to worry about them, not going to sweat it. That's not the message that I want to show you all today. This is what I want to show you today. If you got a tall variety, and this is sort of the short version of this, If you've got a tall variety that's pretty sensitive to growth control, like on the bottom of that graph, that's 15, 18 and that group of stuff, and it gets an inch out of whack height-wise, whatever you want to call an inch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If it gets an inch taller than I intended, that penalty for that's about 17 pounds of lint an acre across this series of tests, and I know every case is different. That sounds like a lot until you realize you got a variety like 1646 that's tall, that's not very sensitive to growth control, and it gets an inch out of whack height-wise. The penalty for that's about 31 pounds an acre. So you think about how many fields, I think about how many fields I looked at in my career that were a foot too tall. You get 10 inches out of whack growth-wise, they're 300 pounds in the hole all of a sudden. And the only way to intercept that is to truly intercept it. You got to be aggressive, appropriately aggressive, early enough in the season with timing and rate of PGRs. And there are cases where population needs to be adjusted and all of those things, because the penalty for not doing them is enormous. I had a cotton grower this winter. I do about, 50 or 60 meetings in the winter all over the U.S. I had a grower tell me this winter, that's the most satisfying and terrifying thing I've ever seen. I got to go home and get my act together. And I think that's probably right. But I'm not trying to scare anybody. Maybe scared straight's a better term. Back to the narrow way of being more aggressive, knowing the background of the products that you plant, knowing how they behave and how they grow, so you can place them better. You can have a sort of philosophical conversation with yourself and consultant, and know what to do and how to be more aggressive when you need to. Now, somebody always asks me, you say it's 31 pounds of lint penalty an inch of height. Well, I don't say that. The data's saying that. But secondarily, the next question they always ask is, what's an extra inch of height? Well, I can't answer that for every case, but I can tell you what I observe at Scott, and I think it pretty broadly applies across most of the southern, at least the deep south, probably the northern deep south, and on up in the southeast. But when you get like out to West Texas, all bets are off. They may make 1,700 pounds on a plant that tall. You get to Georgia, they may make 1,500 on one that tall if the weather cooperates. So it varies some by region. But for Scott, in this case, this is the same data flipped around and done a different way. And I was just most tickled with my playing around this computer when I figured out how to make these dots different colors. That was quite the little ordeal. But they're colored from high to low, from green to red, and you get what I'm getting at there. I split the graph at 1,250 pounds and 60 inches tall. You can pick your height you like, but here's where you need to consider and things you need to look at. Look at how many of these high-yielding dots over 1,250 pounds are between 40 and 60 inches tall. Look how few of these high-yielding dots are over 60 inches and how many of these low-yielding dots are over 60 inches. Myself, there's a way to pull that out of there, and that's part of what we're going to get to if I get into the deeper version of this. I take 44-ish, 48 inches, something along that line. Now, on a bunch of that dirt there at Scott, that real strong, silty sand, I'm aiming at my belt, and if it coasts to that high, I call that a tie. You wrestle it to the ground. That's about as good as you can do. But there are modifications you can do agronomically of populations and other things that make it easier to fight to that tie. That's the point of the matter, because the risk is great. And I don't know that I've ever seen data that really put any quantities on it other than this little data set right here. And it's been very, very popular with a lot of folks. The last thing I'm going to share with you, what time are we supposed to be done with this? 10? We started a few minutes early. I just want to make sure I don't go over it all.
I'll get you.
Well, I'm not trying to ask an awkward question. I knew you'll wrestle me to the ground. We did one thing here that I think is just a happy for the cotton industry. Now, we did it for the right reason. But what we actually did last year is we've been evaluating row configurations. Wide row, narrow, solid, 76 inch, all those questions are coming and going. And I'm not going to share with you the row configuration thing. I will tell you this, I think those wider row configurations are yield limited compared to solid. Our data would say that. But over the year, last several years, we've looked at them repeatedly. And we did something just basically on a lark that I noticed in a test about 5 or 6 years ago. We noticed a bunch of 5-lock bolls. And as far as I know, every cotton farmer in the United States is sort of required to have a big fat 5-lock bowl in his heater vent right before harvest time every year. I got one. I don't know of a farm truck that doesn't have one that grows cotton. I asked some of the old mentors I work with 100 times, is a 5-lock bowl bigger than a 4-lock? And they told me no. It's got fewer seeds per locule, one more locule. No, forget it. But I also couldn't find any data that wasn't 110 years old, and there is some about 110 years old, that quantified it, so we took the time to. And y'all know how this happens. If you ever box map cotton, positionally map cotton, it's a pretty horrendous process. So you set you up a box, and you got one of these buckets for every position, and you pick each node and each position off, and you drop it in the bucket, and you drop a penny or a marble or a bean or something with it. At the end, you shake as many of those marbles out of that seed cotton as you can, and you count them so you know how many bowls are in there. You can weigh it and do all kind of other stuff to it. Well, I actually sort of just invented, I guess you'd say, a better way to do it. My crew suggested we needed a counter instead of the pennies and the marbles. Well, that was the first innovation. So I built this doohickey on the bottom, which we call the bowlometer. That's my fancy name for it. One of my many time-consuming hobbies is fixing electronics. And I found some plans and schematics that I thought would work, modified them, had a circuit board made. We put these things together in the Learning Center. And we've got one built for each of these buckets in each of these positions so we can positionally map, and you don't have all that counting the pennies and the marbles at the end. You can get on moving on down the road doing that. Well, as if the positional mapping wasn't bad enough, I made it double bad, because I decided we were going to map whether it had 4 locules or 5. And we're on about 5 or 6 years of this. So if it had 4 locks, you put it in the bottom bucket. If it had 5, you put it in the white bucket, and you punch the button. Well, that sped us up and got us going, got us moving. We mapped 60 of these plots across all these row configurations and populations and varieties and all that kind of thing. At the end, I went and made up a set of dummy plot tags, sent them into the gin, had them all ginned. They did HVI on the fiber. They delinted the seed. We went back over there and counted the seed, so I knew how many bowls were in there, how much they weighed, and how many seed were in them. Delinted. Now you lose some, but of course there's some error in there. We wound up with this result from about 11,600 and so, a few bowls, and we probably got another 60 or 70,000 bowls we've done over the few years. Of those, 13 or so percent of them were 5-lock, 85 or so percent of them were 4-locule, fair enough. But they're not uniformly distributed across variety and population. I'll show you that in a minute as a tease to come back and see what we've done. But I was delighted to call one of my old bosses in Utah and tell him he was wrong about the size of a 5-lock bowl. Turns out across that population of bowls, you got 20% more locules, you got 20% more seed cotton, which is what that is, you got 20% more lint, you got 20% more seed, and it basically weighs more because it's got one more locule, equivalent locule to the rest of them. Now, the turnout and all the fiber properties, micronair, length, strength, and I know y'all probably can't see that directly, they were all basically identical. But the point of it is, we know for a fact that cotton compensates for a lot of stuff that happens to it. You think about it. You know one of my mottos, my primary motto in a cotton patch? Never say die in a cotton field. Don't give up. You got nerve and money, you can generally make it better. If you'll hang on, it'll usually make something. It may not make full potential back. But it turns out that one of the mechanisms to compensate for some of that trouble is actually this bowl size business, and they can come back. If you lose the bottom, you put bowls in the top, all that kind of thing. But it turns out as population is reduced, we increase the percentage of the bowls that have 5 locules. There's also a big difference in varieties, and this is what I'll leave you with. You look at 2038 Any of you that ever dealt with it, you know it's kind of a weird variety. It's about that wide in the bottom, about 2 feet off the ground, and it's about that wide till you stop it from growing in the top. It has more 5-lock bolls in it than all the rest of them all the time. Now, the bad news of that is I can't tell you how to go home and make more of them 5-locule other than keeping energy in balance and doing what needs to be done, because it turns out that about 25 days pre-bloom, each bowl decides, based on the energy available to it, whether it's going to keep that 5th locule or drop it. And what did we talk about being a good policy for energy management? Don't have excess growth, don't have excess competition because of too much seed, don't overdo it. And it turns out that this is one of the things that helps decide, and it also mainly helps explain some of the things we observe. I had a lot of people after harvest last year that called me about 2038 and said, you can forget that, I ain't doing that again. There's not any rolls on the end of that turn row, and to a person they called back and said, hold that thought. We ginned that, and the turnout of it is shockingly high. Turns out most of that additional turnout, I think, could be proven to be these 5-locule bowls. But regardless, the gist of it and the proof of it actually sort of applied to each situation is, of all the bowls we sampled, 13.5% of them were 5-lock bowls, and they made 16% of the dry weight. So that says they contribute more. And the really, really interesting implication of that is we talk about corn and not letting corn stress when it's this tall because it's forming the rows around and long as being part of flex. That's flex in cotton. It's the same thing. It's just applied a different way, and it's done 100 times over 90 days rather than once over a week or 2 weeks. So with that, I'll stop right there. That's what I brought to show y'all. If there's anything y'all would like to add to that or do with it, let me know. I'll share it with you. It's all yours, or your customers. If you've ever bought anything we sell, you paid for it. So you're welcome to it. Brent, I don't know if you got a question or we got time or what.
Yeah, I mean, we got a few minutes if there's any questions.
I didn't use but 5 minutes of my extra time.
I mean, put him through something.
How long have y'all been using the PGRs?
The first, that's a whole nother story. Actually, if you think about what happened with PGRs, PIX, mepiquat chloride, I say PIX generically because it's all generic now basically. Mepiquat chloride was introduced under experimental licenses sort of a thing in the late 70s, 79. The problem is that mepiquat was recommended. I was 9 years old when this happened, but I know the stories because people still tell them. It was recommended at a pint per acre at bloom and a pint 2 weeks later in 1980. And it's getting to be fewer and fewer people that remember 1980 at these meetings, but y'all remember 1980? That was a bad deal. And down there where I grew up on the Macon Ridge, that cotton was about that tall when they tried to pick 2 naughty little bowls out of it, and that experience still lingers with people. You still hear this, I don't want to shut my cotton down with PIX, and that still is a threat, but it's not the threat it used to be. So the answer to your question, 40 years. And honestly, I would say probably in the last 15, we've actually figured out how to do it reasonably well. There's another one too that Bayer makes called Stance, and that's a whole other story. And we work on that too. Well, I appreciate y'all listening.